All right, Ani, hello everyone. Welcome to the Acoustic Telemetry Workshop. I'm looking forward to all the talks today and sharing some cool telemetry stuff around the lake. To begin, we will pass it over to our elder Justin to have some words to start us off. Justin? Oh, Chris, your phone's muted there.
My phone is muted?
Oh, no, sorry. Chris is with our elder Justin. There you go. Go ahead, Chris and Justin.
Bonjour. Acoustic Telemetry Nawash Nawash Mina Kelli Boram. Anishinabek Chippewas Mapi. Sakswamina Mandat Wagon. We pray in the mosque that these will have a good day. Good progress for this ventures that you are on regarding the Giigoonyag, the fish, allowing us to find where the white fish have gone, keep our waters and shorelines clean. Every year I used to go up towards the lighthouse and smoke my pipe, and I'd offer tobacco to the water first thing, and then to the grandfathers, the rocks that are on there, and then I would pray to the Manitouk and ask them to cleanse the water, cleanse the fish that live in the water, so that they may process, that we may have a food supply for the community, so that we may acknowledge them and respect them for what they give us, for what the Creator's creation has provided for us in a good way, and honor that with tobacco. It's very important. How we quiz as well. Honey, what you know, we could be Yamada, Monkey. Which for this day, Jimmy, which for this life, which for the lessons that you have told upon this community, which for allowing me to walk on Mother Earth for 68 years, which for all the blessings, all the life lessons that you have provided. Learn, allow us to achieve this goal, trying to reach regarding the eagle, the waters along our traditional territory, Anishinabek, all the land, all the animals, all the birds, all the insects, crawlers. We give thanks for them. We give thanks for our ancestors who have gone on before us, but have blazed the trail for us to accept these things to learn. We too, like blazers, are waiting for the next 7 generations to come behind us and pick up the ceremony, pick up the language, pick up all these things for a good life. Give thanks, acknowledging these fishermen that will catch the fish, provide it for the community at this time of the fires that has come into our area. We give thanks to the humanity for allowing us to maintain a good, healthy way. And to Giigoonyag for all who are in this conference today. Giigoonyag. Oh, are you there?
Yeah, thanks, Justin. appreciate you sharing those words with us. That was great. So we sent out an agenda of today, and we will likely finish earlier than later. I just wanted to share, the whole point of this meeting, this workshop, is to share some information about telemetry and encourage participation. As you'll hear from our presenters, there's a lot of opportunities for collaboration and chances for your community or your agency to get involved with telemetry. And it's a really exciting time in Lake Huron and Georgian Bay. Just some housekeeping rules. If you could please keep muted during our presentations. There will be question periods following each presentation. If you have a question, just use the chat feature or raise your hand, and we'll record your name and get back to you during the question period. So I guess without further ado, I would like to introduce our first presenter, Christopher Vandergoot from GLATOS.
Thank you very much, Alexander. I appreciate the invitation to come here and share kind of what's been going on actually for like the last decade on the Great Lakes. As you'll see, the project started off very small in a fairly confined areas, throughout the basin. But over the last 10 years, as we've been having more partners join and expanding the network and tagging more fish, the receiver network and our ability to track the movements of fish has expanded tremendously. And excitingly, a lot of that is going to be happening in Lake Huron here in the next year or so. There's a couple projects. One of the initial projects actually started on Lake Huron. It was fairly limited in its space and scope, but over the last year, some large projects have popped up, and I anticipate a few more large projects popping up on Lake Huron. So this is a really great time to kind of share what's going on. And as Alexander mentioned, this is going to be more of like what is acoustic telemetry? This is more of a workshop for people who aren't familiar with acoustic telemetry, to give you a little bit of a background on how it works, and then some of the capabilities, and of course, limitations. And I think one of the really neat things about the GLATOS network is that although we work quite a bit with state agencies and federal agencies in both the US and Canada, as well as the tribal organizations, we're also working with the users, like the commercial fishermen and the recreational fishermen. They've been helping us tag fish. And so that's really, really kind of a neat aspect of this. It's not just a bunch of scientists. It's scientists working collaboratively with the people who are fishing the lakes to help understand what's going on. So I'll get started. And as Alex mentioned, there'll certainly be time for questions, and I'll do my best to answer them to the best of my ability. Do I need to go ahead and just share my screen? Is that, yeah. Okay, and here we go. All right, are you seeing a slide with telemetry?
Yep, you're good.
All right, excellent. Let me get my cheat notes and we'll be ready to go. All righty. So what is GLATOS? GLATOS stands for the Great Lakes Acoustic Telemetry Observation System. And basically what we are is we are a binational consortium of scientists who use telemetry to understand the complex fish behaviors and then provide this information to the managers so they can set regulations and bag limits that promote the goals of the fishery as well as the long-term sustainability. So in a nutshell, that is what GLATOS is. Let's see here. So primarily the funding for GLATOS started off with the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, and then as well as money from the Great Lakes Research Initiative in the United States. So the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, or GLRI, is US funding. The Great Lakes Fishery Commission actually is a binational organization where both funds from Canadian and US entities come together to help facilitate management in the Great Lakes Basin. In addition to the primary funding sources, we have a lot of assistance from other organizations that help us perform our mission. So you have the USGS helping with deploying receivers and maintaining receivers, as well as tagging a lot of fish. the Great Lakes Observation System. I saw Kelli on the list here. They host our website and the data portal, and what you'll find is that's instrumental to the success of GLATOS. And then we partner with places like the Ocean Tracking Network. We actually kind of work with the Ocean Tracking Network. They're a global tracking entity, and we work closely with them to keep up on technology and things of that nature. And then something that's new to the Great Lakes Basin is this real-time aquatic ecosystem observation network, or RAON, which focuses on like understanding the abiotic conditions, you know, temperature, DO, and nutrients and things like that. So now what we're hoping to do is pair the fish movements with what's actually going on in the lake conditions. So how does the GLATOS network work? Well, basically what we do is we connect acoustic telemetry researchers and their projects. And we do this primarily through two ways. The first is that we maintain a database where researchers can upload and store their data. And then secondly, we have annual coordination meetings where we get together, we share our results, we talk about challenges and difficulties, and kind of, you know, collaboratively work together to solve problems. And we also do things like I'm doing here today, reaching out to individual groups that are interested in telemetry or just want to learn more about it in the Great Lakes Basin. So the mission of GLATOS is pretty simple. It's just to unravel the mysteries of Great Lakes fish. You know, we all have this very simplistic thought pattern of how fish are moving, but the reality of it is it's way, way, way more complex than we ever thought possible. And what we're doing is helping to understand those movements. And then our mission is simply to facilitate and conduct acoustic telemetry research in support of fishery science and management in the Great Lakes Basin. GLATOS has no management authority. We can't set regulations, but what we do is we work side by side with the managers to help answer the questions that they have. And we do this, and so we provide information, managers with information that traditional fishery assessment gears are unable to provide. So, you know, we're familiar with trawls and gill nets and surveys like that. Telemetry provides a different type of information about the fine and broad scale movements that just really wouldn't be feasible with any other type of sampling gear. And so we kind of get our, as you were, our marching orders, or, you know, what's important from through the Great Lakes Fishery Commission and the Council of Lake Committees. If you're not familiar with this entity, basically the managers from all the lakes form this Council of Lake Committees. And this is where they discuss the management priorities and the challenges. And so we kind of listen to what they're saying, and we try to, we encourage researchers to develop projects that help address these priorities and what's going on so they can better manage the system. So here I have is just going to be a very broad scale look at how telemetry works. So basically what it works is it consists of individual researchers going out, oh, my slide, oh, there you go. Individual researchers going out and deploying these acoustic receivers, and we'll talk about that in a little bit later, across the basin. So you have Francine deploying some, say, in Lake Superior, and Tom in Lake Huron, and Joe in Lake Michigan, and Jessica in Lake Erie, and John in Lake Ontario. So all these researchers are independently deploying these receivers. And then individual researchers go out and tag fish. So in this example, Francine is tagging lake sturgeon in the St. Mary's River, right? She wants to see what lake sturgeon are doing. And what all these researchers do in common is that they download their receivers on a regular basis, they change the batteries, they redeploy the receivers, and then they upload or they submit their data to the GLATOS web data portal. So all this detection data is stored on this computer that's you know, kind of facilitated and overseen with the help of GLOS, right, up on this data portal. And what that does is, as individual fish swim around to the different receivers and they're detected on individual receivers, a researcher is actually able to leverage or utilize those other receivers that are deployed throughout the basin to understand where their fish went. So even though Francine didn't deploy receivers in Lake Ontario or Lake Michigan or Lake Huron or Erie, if her fish swims by those receivers, that data is recorded there. It's stored up on the GLATOS web portal, and then she's actually able to go to the website and pull her detection data back down from receivers that she didn't deploy. Now, she doesn't have access to other people's fish detection data. She only has access to her fish detection data. So this is the important caveat here, is that even though you're sharing your detection files with everybody, your own fish data remains, with you. It's it's the researcher's individual data. Now, we hope people collaborate and we try to facilitate that. But at the end of the day, researchers can rest assured that nobody else has access to the information from the fish that they've tagged. So here, real quickly, I'm going to share an animation with you. And this kind of shows the development of the GLATOS network through time. So we started out in 2010. You can see there were some projects in Lake Huron, in Lake Erie, a few in the Straits up there by Lake Superior. And then as time went on and as more organizations joined the GLATOS network and were conducting studies, what you see is the network just proliferating, just expanding and blossoming. And that's exactly what we hope would happen. We hope as more people got involved, the receiver coverage would expand tremendously so that we could increase our capabilities of following fish across the basin. If you don't have a receiver in an area, you really can't say if a fish was there or not. But this is the way that the network has kind of changed through time. And so you see a list of all the organizations that are participating. And as of last October, we've had 361 individual researchers that are a part of the GLATOS network. So I talked a little earlier about the work that's going on in Lake Huron and how it's changing. So working collaboratively with, again, forgive me, I forget exactly which group, but working with Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources. Alex, I think you were involved with this, right?
Yeah, the Saugeen Ojibway Nation.
Yep.
Parks Canada as well.
Yeah. So there was a big project that started last fall in Lake Huron, and those are and the receivers that are going to be deployed with that project are highlighted there in the white. Now, we realize that we really need to have receivers on the U.S. water, in the U.S. waters. And so those are receivers that we're proposing go in the water either this year or next year to help understand the broad scale movements of fish across the entire basin. So we have some receivers that are currently deployed up in the northwest corner for a Cisco project, as well as a lake sturgeon project that's going on in the St. Mary's River. But what you can see is hopefully by the end of 2021 or 2022, we will have all of Lake Huron wired. So as fish leave different areas, we'll be able to intersect them and understand where they're moving. You can imagine the collaborative nature of these projects and how many partners and organizations need to be working together to pull a feat like this off. So basically, Lake Huron is going to look very similar to what's going on in Lake Erie and Lake Ontario in the very near future. So the data policy for GLATOS is pretty simple. Each principal investigator determines who can access their project's detailed biological tagging data and subsequent detections of those tagged fish, consistent with their own agency or funding source policy. So we revert to the individual researchers and to whatever level they are comfortable sharing their information and who they want to collaborate with. Sometimes this is a misunderstanding. And the reality of it is GLATOS owns no data. That's the data is not ours. We just facilitate the research and help store and organize it. The individual researchers, quote unquote, earn the data. We do encourage researchers to collaborate, but again, that's left up to the individuals because there are some really broad scale ecosystem questions. You think about it, we're tagging Cisco's and lake trout and walleye and whitefish. You think about the differences in these fish, we can really start understanding, I think, some of the ecological processes going on across the basin when more researchers collaborate together. But again, we leave that up to the individual. So now let's get into the nuts and bolts of telemetry and whatnot. So there's two primary components. There are the acoustic transmitters, or the tags, and there are the receivers. So the tags or the transmitters are what we put in an individual fish, and the receivers basically sit out there passively listening for a fish. If a fish swims by close enough to the receiver, it it collects the information that that tag emits. And usually the information consists of a tag number, as well as if it has a sensor on it, it may tell us how deep the fish is swimming or what water temperature the fish is residing in. And in fact, there are now some new tags that we can determine if a fish was eaten with predation tags. So there's a lot of really cool sensors. I shouldn't say cool. Cool sounds like it's a trendy thing, but there are a lot of valuable sensors that we can couple with these transmitters to understand what the fish are doing when they are out in the environment. So we attach these to fish. Actually, we generally implant them. We surgically implant them into the fish. And then each tag emits a unique code that isn't the same as any other one. So we can track individual fish. And then the receivers, they just sit there listening for a detection, and then they'll timestamp when that detection is received on the receivers. So this differs from traditional tagging studies, like if you were to tag a fish with an external tag, in that with those other type of tagging studies, you really only know when the fish was tagged and when it was recaptured. Basically, by putting transmitters in fish, we have an idea of what's going on in between those periods. And we're able to understand what's going on with fish that are never captured once they're released. So this is a simple schematic of how telemetry works. And so this is where you have a solitary receiver, just one receiver deployed somewhere out in the lake, right? So if a fish comes within what we call the detection range of a receiver, when that signal is given off, and so the signal code looks something like this right here, it's time-stamped on the receiver. And so then we assume the fish is within some distance of that receiver at that time. We don't know if it's right on top of the receiver or at the edge of the detection range, but we assume that the fish is within some known distance of that receiver. And then again, if it has a sensor on it, it may record what depth that fish is occupying at that point. The other type of monitoring we use and would be more for fine scale positioning, where we can actually determine through triangulation the exact coordinates of the fish. It's not where the receivers are. It uses the deployed receivers, but we're actually able to determine, so a latitude and a longitude of where that fish is, if that fish is being detected by 3 or more receivers at the same time. And so we use this information to understand like how fish use a spawning reef, or how fish react after they're tagged, and things of that nature. What type of habitat they're using. There's a really cool study up in Lake Superior where they're looking at the effect of common carp in the rice beds of the wild rice beds in an embayment. And what they're able to understand is how the common carp are kind of associating with the rice beds as they're thinking about restoration activities. So this gives really fine scale information. We're able to track the fish within a few meters using this approach, but it relies on a lot of receivers in a very small or confined area. So some of the popular uses for acoustic telemetry in the Great Lakes is, one is that we understand population dynamics. And by that, I mean, hey, what contribution do individual stocks make to, say, the commercial fishery or the recreational fishery? Fish that are tagged on this reef or in this bay, what part of the harvest do they actually compromise? Or looking at survival, at what rate are these fish dying due to either natural causes or fishing causes, or just overall survival rates? And then the other one that's kind of neat is testing these assumptions of the assessment models. Like, how good are the gill nets or the trap nets at capturing these fish? We assume that when we set a gill net or some other gear that we know what proportion of the fish we're capturing, but a lot of times we really don't. And so because you have marked fish out there and you're fishing these gears, you can get at what we call catchability, the fraction of fish that are captured with a gear. And then we also look at things like spawning site fidelity. How faithful are individual fish to an individual reef or tributary or something like that? Or will these things just spawn all over the place? We've seen a lot of different variations on this, and I think a lot of that is relatively new to some managers, and actually explains the genetics that we're seeing when we take these genetic samples. So we look at other things like behavior. What are the migratory patterns of fish of different stocks. Dam and barrier passage. In Lake Erie, they removed a large dam on the Ballville, on the Sandusky River. It took 2 years before we started seeing fish move past that dam removal. But now fishermen are catching fish above the dam, and we'll have to see if we actually have any of our tagged fish on the receivers that are above that site. So again, another great use for evaluating like if dam removals actually help fish passage. Looking at habitat use, spawning behavior, and then also spawning phenology. Where and when do fish spawn? We'll use that for lake trout and Lake Erie. We have no idea where they spawn. Tag a bunch of fish, put a bunch of receivers out there, and we're starting to nail down where and when they spawn in the Eastern Basin. And then another thing is just understanding the ecology of these fish, how they interact with other species, as well as the environment. When we have issues like hypoxia or nutrient loading or things like that, how do the fish relate to these environmental variables and how the environment is changing through time? So this may lose some of you, but don't worry about it. It's not entirely necessary that you grasp this. So each transmitter operates on what we call a tag frequency. So it's some frequency of which these receivers are able to determine an acoustic signal. And we have two primary frequencies that we use in the Great Lakes. Either it's the 69 kilohertz or 180 kilohertz frequency. And that's measured by pulse position modulation, or PPM. Again, not necessary that you know that detail. One thing though that we need to discuss, or at least you should be aware of, is that while these tags operate on the 69 kilohertz frequency, vendors have their own way of programming these things. So you need to make sure that you're using tags, or you select tags and receivers that are compatible with what other researchers are using out in the lake. So right now, a lot of the telemetry, primarily exclusively of the telemetry equipment, is produced by Innovasi, which was formerly Vemco. So if you were to do some telemetry work and you were to purchase your equipment from another vendor, which you certainly can do that, it may or may not be compatible, unfortunately, with all the receivers that are deployed out there. This is something that's being driven by the market, not by GLATOS itself. This is kind of what the market is doing. And, this is kind of something we're having to adapt and accommodate. So that's just a pretty important consideration to keep in mind as you contemplate studies that you might be interested in. So something about the transmitter specifications, and this relates to tag size. So as you go from a small tag to a large tag, and when I say small tag, I'm talking about something the size of like a Tic Tac or like an ibuprofen pill, right? Something fairly small to something as large as about a AA battery. And as you go from a small transmitter to a larger transmitter, there's an increase in battery life. A small transmitter can't hold a large battery like a larger tag. And so the smaller tags generally have a very short battery life, anywhere from months to maybe less than a year. They're also not as loud and can't necessarily be detected as far as a larger tag. And of course, as you can imagine, you won't want to put a big tag in a small fish. So a lot of times you're constrained with the size of the tag that you can use. So when you're thinking about your study and what you want to do, there's two things you kind of want to keep in mind. You want to try to use the smallest tag that meets your battery longevity and detection range requirements, right? So if you can only afford so many receivers, and you have a small detection range, you either A, have to put them fairly close together, or you have to understand you may not see those transmissions as often because it takes the signal may not transmit as far. And so that's why we generally recommend that you conduct some type of pilot study or field-based tagging study when you're talking about tagging a new species, or when using larger tags that have not been tested before, right? So fortunately for you, there's been a lot of work on the Great Lakes. We've tagged everything from lake sturgeon, which are very, very large and have a very, very large tag. And we've even tagged small things like round gobies and bloaters. which are, of course, very small. So we have collected some information out there, and we can help talk through some of the things there with you. Keep in mind that just like with any organism, some fish are more sensitive to handling than others, right? Sturgeon, very robust. Lake trout, same story. You start talking about the whitefish and the ciscos, well, sometimes I think if you look at them cross-eyed, they might, keel over. So you got to really have that in mind when you're designing a study. And that's why GLATOS is here to help draw on the experience of other researchers for the past 10 years to help in the design of your study. We don't necessarily want to be involved with your study. Like, this is not a door for us to get into your study by the least, but we're paid to help facilitate and conduct these studies. So we want to help make your project a success. So please utilize that resource, and we'll set up times to talk with you if that's something you are interested in doing. I am going to skip over this. The only thing you really need to know about this slide is that if you have too many fish in a small area, we have this phenomenon called tag collision, meaning if one tag is going off and another tag is going off at the same time, they basically collide and knock each other out, just like if you're playing, what is that, bocce or something like that? And they knock each other out, and neither one of them is detected. So we kind of need to be aware of who else is conducting a study in the area that you're working, as well as how many fish you're releasing at a given time, or how many fish you might think are coming back to a small area where the tags may be colliding. So for example, in Drummond Island, one of the first studies didn't realize that survival was going to be so high. So they had a lot of lake trout coming back the following year to spawn, and they had a lot of tag collision issues. And so we can remedy that by increasing the duration of when the tags transmit, so that they're not transmitting as frequently, but there's a trade-off in that you may not get as many observations, or you may not detect a fish if it's moving quickly through an area. So these are all things you need to think about when you're designing a study. And again, we can certainly provide some assistance with that. So basically, this is a very colorful graph, a lot of different lines. Basically, this kind of talks about this tag collision issue I was referring to. And so what you can see from this figure is that if you have a tag that has a short nominal delay, so in this example, the red tags have a 60-second nominal delay. That means every 60 seconds, and then we build some error around it. So it may be every 30 to 90 seconds, tags are being transmitted, but on average, it's 60 seconds. If you have 20 fish, in a fairly small area, the probability of collision is like 100%. Now, if you were to increase that nominal delay to 240 seconds, which I think is what, 6 minutes? Is that right? Am I doing my math? 6 times 4, yeah, 24. Okay, so if you increase that, you can have the same number of fish in the area. Now you only have a 60% chance of collision, and that may be okay. Some level of tag collision is okay. That means in an hour, you would only get, say, half of the transmissions you would expect to have. Now, if you have a tag going off every 4 minutes, right? Yeah, every 4 minutes. I can't do the math real quickly, but that's about 25 times or so, I think. You would only be getting about 12 detections per hour, which may be sufficient for your study. But those are some things you need to think about when it comes to designing a tagging project. So that's why the text here, coordination among researchers working in the same area, is critical. If you're working on a reef and you're doing a whitefish study and other people are doing a lake trout study, they may be using the same reef to spawn, right? But if they're all there at the same time, that could be a problem. So this is why the coordination is so important for what we do. I realize I'm kind of going a little bit long, so I'm going to try to hurry along, Alex, unless we're good on time. You tell me.
Yeah, no rush. We're well ahead of schedule. So
okay, all right. So not okay. You're okay. Sounds good. Okay, so I talked earlier about these tags that can actually detect predation, and so to me, this is like one of the coolest things. So the way these tags work. Oh, all right. Let me back up. The tags can collect different types of environmental data that's going on, right? So I mentioned before that these tags can collect temperature data. So basically, because fish are cold-blooded or poikilothermic animals, their body temperature is the same temperature as their environment, unless they only go into a different temperature for a very, very short period of time. But actually, what we're finding is that these transmitters are capable of adjusting to the body of the fish within like 8 minutes, or in actually a fairly short period of time. So if a fish is in a warmer or colder water for some duration, the tags will actually pick up on that. This is kind of really interesting because it allows us to understand if fish are doing, like, say, vertical migrations, or if they're coming inshore or offshore to utilize prey, maybe in the warmer water, and then going back to the cooler water to retreat to kind of save that energy. We're also able to measure the depth of a fish indirectly through pressure. The tags have a pressure sensor on them, and as the fish moves from one depth of water to another, they're actually able to determine through some math at what depth that fish is occupying when the transmitter signal is being emitted. These tags also have accelerometry, or the rate at which fish are swimming. So we're able to get a swimming speed when fish are in an area if you have the tag program with this accelerometer sensor on it. And then the third one here is this predation tag. And this is actually a fairly new development within the last like 2 or 3 years. So like if you were working with a species like cisco or round gobies or yellow perch, and they were eaten by a predator, that transmitter actually changes its coding sequence. And so we're able to understand when that tag or when that fish was consumed, assuming that there's some delay in the time that the body, the fish acid in the stomach, dissolves or starts digesting the fish. There's a sensor in there that dissolves when the fish is being digested, and then it emits a different signal. So they're actually able to determine when these fish are dying due to predation. And then researchers on Lake Ontario are actually using that information then to predict whether it was like a lake trout, a brown trout, or a lake salmon that consumed that fish. So the technology and the capabilities, it seems like every 3 years there's like this huge advancement. And so this one is really quite interesting, especially as we think of things like cisco reintroductions and Coragonid reintroductions in the Great Lakes, and what stocking rates and predation rates may look like to achieve whatever objectives are put on those populations. All right, so we'll talk a little bit about different ways of deploying these receivers. So traditionally or historically, we started with putting these double lines out across areas. And so here you have Green Bay as a good example. So the middle of Green Bay, you had these 2 parallel lines running from shore to shore. And then you had another one up there at the northern end of the Door Peninsula. So basically what that did is if a fish moved from one area, say southern Green Bay into northern Green Bay, because there are 2 receivers there that are separated, we would be able to determine directional movement. So that was important for some managers to say, hey, we need to know what fraction of the population are migrating from one area to the next, or from Green Bay out to the main lake. More recently, we've actually done some computer simulations, and we've been testing it out in the lakes itself, where the same number of receivers are deployed in a grid across a large geographic area. And it gives us better understanding of what those fish are doing throughout the course of the year, right? So think about this. A fish may, leave one of the tributaries in southern Green Bay, mill around the southern end of Lake Green Bay for 2 or 3 months, then migrate north, mill around there for 2 or 3 months. But if it's in an area with no receivers, we have no idea what the fish is doing. By deploying those receivers in a grid-like fashion across the length of Green Bay, we're able to opportunistically see that fish as it's moving around and get even just snapshots of what that fish is doing over a longer time scale, and providing a lot more information. So this is the way that a lot of these receiver grids are starting to be deployed. Now, when you're in a river system, we tend to still do these like individual receivers, because generally they can detect across a river, across the bank. But, you know, if you're using a small transmitter, you may need to have multiple receivers to make sure that you're detecting a fish as it moves through that area. Something to keep in mind is that the environment, the detection range, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, is really influenced by a lot of factors. So one of the factors it's influenced by, of course, is the power of the tag. A small tag is not going to have as much power as a larger tag because it has a smaller battery. In addition to that, the environment has a lot to do with whether or not a transmitter is going to be detected or not. So you can imagine if you're in a bay where there's a lot of boats on the weekend, and there's a lot of ambient noise from the boat motors and just all that kind of stuff, it's going to be a loud environment, and the tags are not going to be detected on the receivers as often as they would, say, in a quiet environment, say out on the offshore areas, you know. But also the substrate has a lot to do. We see considerable detection ranges, you know, in rocky versus, you know, muddy or soft bottoms, because the sound travels differently, just like in a room, right? If you're in a garage with aluminum siding and somebody slams a hammer, wow, it's pretty loud. But if somebody were to do that in a room with like sheetrock or with rugs and stuff on the walls, it's not going to be as loud. So the environment that you're working with really affects what your detection range is going to be. So that could also be negatively impacted by aquatic vegetation. Again, the sound can't transmit through that aquatic vegetation as easily as in an environment where there is none. The ice actually presents a whole nother set of challenges because the signal can bounce around and it may be a lot further under the ice than during open water periods. And then, of course, in the nearshore areas, when you have a large wind event and the waves are pounding the shoreline, again, all about the ambient of the surroundings can affect your detection range. So one way to figure out what your detection range is, there's a couple different ways. And one is like a drift test. And that would be very simply where you deployed a receiver and you had a tag in your boat and you just like drift away from it. And you got a sense of how far away you could actually hear that tag, you know, as you drifted away. That's something that usually is done, you know, in rivers, and something that is done when you need a quick answer. The static range test is, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a second, is probably the most ideal. This is where you deploy a tag and numerous receivers over a long period of time, hopefully over like months, if possible, to get a good idea of what your detection range is as the seasons change and as wind events and the environmental changes begin, whether it's stratified or not stratified. This kind of gives you the best idea of, you know, what's going on, you know, and what your detection range might be. And probably the most preferred, or another real good way of doing this, is this in situ monitoring. That's where you actually deploy a tag at a known distance from a receiver and you just leave it out there during the study. So you get an idea of, okay, I estimated my detection range to be 500 meters. How good was that estimate? And, you know, at what percentage of the time was I able to hear at least 500 meters? So there's a lot of different ways to do this, but understanding the detection range and of the tag you're using and the environment that you're working on is very important for these telemetry studies. And so this is kind of what one of these static testings look like. And so what you can see is here we have a tag that's deployed, and then at fixed distances away from the tag or the transmitter, you have these receivers and you develop these curves. So during the best conditions here shown in the green, at 400 meters, you're like at, say, 90% detection range. But under bad conditions, that may drop to 70%. And bad conditions could just simply mean a windstorm, or it could be the weekend where there's a lot of boat traffic. Or you could assume to get 40% detection range, which may be suitable for your study objectives if your receivers are 600 meters apart. But when bad conditions occur, you may get no detections. So these are some things that you kind of got to keep in mind as you're thinking about designing a study and then conducting one of these studies. I don't think that this is like advanced Jedi tag detection modeling and things like that. Just suffice it to say that having an idea of what your detection ranges are is very important. Like when you're going to put a line across an area, so you make sure fish can't sneak in or sneak across it without being detected. So that's where, you know, if you're spacing these receivers, say every 500 meters across a peninsula or a bay, and you want to make sure they can't sneak across, you better make sure that even during the worst conditions, there's sufficient overlap so that you can actually detect that fish as it moves across. And so this figure right here, or this picture right here, just shows a lot of the different ways that we've been deploying receivers throughout the Great Lakes Basin. Some of them are very simple, where we're driving a stake into the ground, a metal rebar in the river, or it's on some type of anchor, and the receiver is just deployed and it just attached to that. That's something where you could, generally this, so if we put an anchor out there in the shallow water, this is just a PVC shuttle actually that holds it, then you're going to want to chain this off like to the shore. So if you do have a high water event, it doesn't go too far. Here you've chained it, you've kind of driven a stake down into the substrate, so not as high chance of moving. But as you move off to the offshore areas, there's a lot of different methods for deploying them. The earlier projects used a float and a line that actually went to the surface. So you would deploy the receiver, and then you would just, when it was time to retrieve it, you would just pull the buoy up. Now you can imagine that, you know, anything out in the water draws the attention of people. Like fishermen have to fish by a flag when it's put out there, even if it's in bad water or what they wouldn't traditionally fish. If they see a flag out there, from my experience, they go fish it. I want to do a study on this because it's really, really funny. But anyway, you can imagine that people could mess with this, or the environment, the waves could, you know, drag this around, right? So this is an option, but it may not be the best option depending upon where you're working. Some of the other option is where we actually deploy these receivers. The receiver is held up off the bottom with this float, but then there's a snag line here where we actually will go through, when we have the coordinates, drag a grapple and snag that snag line up and pull the whole works right up to the surface and do the maintenance that we need to do. Or we've actually used, you know, these opportunistic buoy deployments where we're using like the channel markers and things like that to suspend our receivers. One of the problems with this method is that we don't own those buoys, and they are pulled and maintained on a time scale that on a time frame that we have no control over. So we really got to coordinate, like with, I'm not sure exactly who deploys these in Canada, but in the US it's the Coast Guard, the US Coast Guard. So I'm sure there's a similar system in Canada. But anyway, we got to work closely with them. And one of the methods we've been going to a lot more recently is this acoustic release, where there's actually acoustic release built into the receiver, where we deploy the receiver into the water. It sits there for however long we want it to be there. We go back to the site. We send a code down with a box that communicates with the receiver, and it floats up to the surface. We're able to retrieve it, download the data, and then redeploy if that's what we're gonna do. We've been moving more and more to these because you don't need the expertise to maintain them. Basically, if you have somebody that's competent at driving a vessel and doing other type of field work, these are really kind of the simplest way to deploy receivers. The problem, though, is, as you can imagine, is this setup with acoustic release costs about 4 times more as that setup, like with a snag line or something else. So there are trade-offs, right? And so that's where we try to work to figure out what's the best for the environment, as well as given the constraints of your project. Selection of the mooring type. Any of you that worked out, you know, on the Great Lakes or in the waters, you realize that it's constrained by a number of things, like the number of the vessel that you're using for deploying and retrieving the gear, right? You can't load a 16-foot John boat up with 15 80-pound anchors, right? That's not going to turn out well for anybody, right? Also, how far offshore you have to go, the water depth, the flow conditions, and things like that. So these are things, again, we've got 10 years of experience, and regrettably, I've probably lost more receivers than any single person in the Great Lakes. And so I can tell you what not to do. And that's, again, though, the power of the GLATOS network, in that we've got a lot of experience and we can tell you what would work, what we think would work given your environment. So this is something that we really encourage people to tap into, because, again, you can do what you want with your own study. It's your money, it's your project. We can help shorten the learning curve when it comes to these things.
Do you have any more slides? We might just move to the questions here.
Okay, we can do that. Yep. Let's do that, because I don't think anything yet. The other stuff is actually not necessary and that we can talk further about.
Awesome. Thanks for your presentation. That was very insightful. I think Caitlin is going to help with the questions here.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks so much, Chris. Very great presentation. We've had some questions come through the chat, so I'm going to read those out. And if they were your questions, feel free to raise your hand to clarify. And then we will have some time to open it up for further questions. And then, of course, we still have the rest of the morning. So the first question is, with regards to spawning site fidelity, are you using acoustic telemetry to see if future generations will come back to the sites where they were born? Or would the newborns be too small to tag? What are the determining factors to tag or not to tag certain fish?
Okay, thank you very much. So natal origin is a very tough one to answer. And so what we can do is we can look at like the number of times an individual fish returns to, like say, for example, I'll just use Lake Erie, what I'm familiar with, Toussaint Reef. We've tagged a lot of fish on Toussaint Reef. Basically, we've seen the same males and the same females come back repeatedly 4 years after the study. What I can't tell you with, what I cannot tell you with acoustic telemetry is where that fish was spawned. Now, we can use other technology, other sampling gears like genetics, or we can take a sample of otoliths for doing otolith microchemistry or something like that. So we can't tell you exactly what the origin is with acoustic telemetry itself, but we can use acoustic telemetry to understand what the spawners that are using the areas are doing, and then use other technologies to maybe get at that question. Does that answer, address the question sufficiently?
Yeah, I think so. Okay, so the next question is, how do we know if a fish has a tag? If we see it.
That's a great question. So because the transmitters are put inside, we generally will also attach an external tag to the fish. Typically, we're putting like it through the dorsal musculature. It's a loop lock-on tag. We've found, at least for walleye, that the T-bar tags have a fairly high shedding rate. So we've been moving more towards the lock-on tags. So this is a consideration for fish that are being harvested, like your whitefish, your walleye, lake trout, and things like that. That's really important, because what I want to know as a stock assessment biologist is, hey, what fraction of these fish are dying due to fishing mortality and natural mortality? Now, we're having a little bit of issues with tagging whitefish where we're kind of seeing some pretty poor survival. So that could actually just because like whitefish are just very temperamental. They're like the fainting goats of the fish world, in my opinion. They just like lay there and then you poke them and they're up swimming around. So we're kind of figuring that out. Another problem we might be having is because we're tagging these fish near the spawning season, and it could either be A, another additional mortality, or B, that just mortality after the spawning season is high. So to get at your question, we generally try to put an external tag on there so that we can identify anglers or fishermen, because those sutures actually will disintegrate and they will fall out within like a year. And it may be difficult for a fisherman to see that fish was tagged. Now, generally, when it comes to the processing table, a big black AA battery slides out on the table, and that's how we get a lot of our reports. But we hope to get it before then. Now, generally, we offer a reward because I want that tag back, because A, if it hasn't been out for very long, like I've had fish that have been out for 24 hours, and I'm like, all right, give me the tag back. I'll go put it in another one. And B, sometimes we need to download the data. So we offer generally $100 reward US for those transmitters so that we can get them back and redeploy them.
Thank you. That's helpful. Our next question is about how can someone get started on a telemetry project? What would you recommend some first steps being? is a general question. I know we'll get to this more in the open discussion, but.
So this is going to sound really boring, but scope out what you really want to know. And in the scientific world, we call those objectives. What do you really want to understand and know? And then we build the project off of that. Again, like I said, you've got a great resource in that. Some of the guys that work for GLATOS, I have researchers that GLATOS hires and pays their salary. They're managing like 4 or 5 projects a year. So they're seeing all of this. Again, we just want to help you. We don't want to be co-authors or anything like that on your projects. We want to help you. As long as you find us useful, we get to stay around. When we're not useful, we go bye-bye. So we want to help you with these studies. So I would just recommend you reach out to us, and prior to reaching out to us, just have a good idea of what you want to do. And then we can, within an hour, we probably can tell you if it's feasible, given telemetry and the technology and whatnot.
Great. Yeah, GLATOS sounds like a great resource. So the next question is, does the transmission power of the tag impact the fish behavior? Why or why not? And how other fish may interact with that tag fish? And then I'm going to add another question to that too, is how often is the equipment calibrated or updated?
Oh my goodness, man. Calibrated. Yeah, you're hitting our Achilles heel. All right, so does it affect the movements of fish? Of course, we can't tell that for sure. We do side-by-side trials, like in controlled environments with respect to survival and things like that. Any of the studies that have been conducted is no, it does not affect the movements of fish with respect to the sound. Is it possible that somebody comes out with a study later down the road? Of course there is, right? I'm not going to be that ignorant. But of all the studies I've seen, no. The biggest thing we get concerned about is the tag burden. Are we putting a tag that's too heavy for a fish? And generally there's this rule of 4%. We generally don't want to put a tag in that's more than 4% of the fish's body weight. But even that can be pushed. So, and then is the equipment calibrated? That's actually a really, really good question. We do have some receivers that are out there for 10 years. We don't know if the detection range dissipates through time. We are actually working with Innovacy to kind of develop some type of metrics to figure out how that works. We focused on how the equipment works in different environments. We don't know how it works over time. So that's why we generally like to put a lot of receivers out there. And you have to be constrained by what you're trying to infer. If you have a receiver in an area and there's not another receiver for 20 kilometers, I can't tell you that a fish wasn't there. I can just tell you it wasn't within maybe 500 meters of that receiver. It could still be using that area, it's just outside the detection range. And so that's why when it comes to your objectives, I want to know the movement of fish in this area. You want to put receivers in that area so that even if one of those receivers goes down, the other receiver may be there to back it up.
Awesome. So it's 10 right now, so I think we'll go to our next presentation. At the very end of all the presentations, we'll have a discussion period, and we'll try to address all the questions that haven't been answered directly. So this next presentation will be given by myself and my colleague Janna Chegahno about our research initiative together with Giigoonyag. So I'll pass it over to Janna to start.
Hello, bonjour, Mino Gichet. Good morning. Thank you everyone for taking the time today to dial into our workshop this morning. Hoping you're finding everything here interesting. Chris's presentation, very interesting. My participation in this project is definitely not scientific or technically related. And Chris, your presentation was good and easy for me to understand when that is not my background or participation area in this project. So I do work for the National Park, for Bruce Peninsula National Park. I'm an Indigenous liaison officer and advisor for the National Park. And my role here is making sure that the relationship with the Saugeen Ojibway Nation is recognized, respected throughout the process for this project, and also with any other projects that we may also have in the works. So with that, we have a slide put together that sort of helps to identify who is Saugeen Ojibway Nation. So throughout the presentation, you might hear the term SUN, and SUN is an acronym for Saugeen Ojibway Nation. And the SUN community or nation is actually made up of two individual First Nations, Chippewas of Nawash, unceded First Nation, and the Chippewas of Saugeen First Nation. So those two together, historically, one nation referred to as Saugeen Ojibway. Nawash, or Chippewas of Nawash, there's a lot of different terms you might hear to describe both of these nations. Chippewas of Nawash is referred to as Nawash, as Cape Croker, as Anishinabek, locally as the Rock. So there's all kinds of different terminology there. And our geographic location, if you're familiar with the Bruce Peninsula, Saugeen Bruce Peninsula at all, we're about 45 minutes from Owen Sound on the Georgian Bay side of the peninsula. Saugeen, the sister nation, Chippewas of Saugeen or Saugeen is typically what I hear this community referred to as. And they are located on the Lake Huron side of the peninsula. And the closest, town is Southampton or Port Elgin. So like I said, although the two communities together are the Saugeen Ojibway Nation, they are still two very separate and distinct First Nation communities with their own independent governance systems. They both have their own chief. They both have their own elected councillors. Currently, the chief for the Chippewas of Nawash would be Oguma Greg Najwan, and for Saugeen, Okuma Lester Anaquat. And you may be aware that the Saugeen Ojibway Nation is in the middle of a land claim to the peninsula. The map image, the yellow in the map image, is the area that is currently under land claim. The light blue area around the peninsula is the area that is under claim for Aboriginal title. So the wording that is cut out here, excerpted, is actually the language from the land claim itself, which is the legal description of Saugeen Ojibway Nation's traditional territory. And if you're able to blow up that map, if you have these informations later, every little colored scale at the bottom will identify which treaty the different areas of the territory are subject to. So Saugeen Ojibway Nation is a very big piece of land. It's a large mass of land, and actually the current boundaries of the Chippewas of Nawash First Nation, they're one of the largest landmass First Nations in Ontario. So even that's pretty significant. But when you look at the size of the whole territory in general, I believe it's 2 or 3 times the size of Prince Edward Island, the province. Historically, it was approximately 2 million acres when the European settlers began to arrive here. And the British Crown negotiated treaties over the 18th and 19th centuries. And what we are left with right now is the 2 First Nation communities that we currently reside in, for Chippewas of Nawash and for Saugeen Ojibway Nation, for Saugeen First Nation, sorry. And that's also ties into the land claim information that was provided on the previous slide. This is one of my favorite maps to show whenever I do a presentation when I'm talking about the history of the Saugeen Ojibway Nation, because this is a map of the Saugeen Peninsula that shows Indian Reserve, which was prior to the Treaty 72 in 1854, which is also the treaty that is before the courts in the land claim. So if you see the one little point that kind of sticks out about halfway down on the Georgian Bay side, to me, it's always looked like a sitting dog. That's Chippewas of Nawash First Nation. And then Saugeen is kind of just across from there on the Lake Huron side. So right now we have these two tiny pocket First Nations, but historically that entire peninsula was the Indian Reserve. And this is a quote that I have found that I also like to share when we're talking about reconciliation and what reconciliation actually is and how that interplays with our ability to meaningfully develop relationships and work together.
I can take it from here. Thanks, Janna. Yeah, so we're involved right now in a research initiative called Together with Giigoonyag. And Giigoonyag is the Ojibway word for fishes, and the title represents our commitment to work with our research partners. And this research project, here are the partners there. So the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, Parks Canada, and then those two bottom logos. One is the Saugeen Ojibway Nation logo, and the other is the Fishery Assessment Program, which I work for currently. And this research initiative is focused around whitefish. Whitefish are very important to the Saugeen Ojibway Nation. As Janna mentioned, there's a large territory and a lot of it's in the water, and we refer to ourselves as fishing people, and one of the most important fish for us is whitefish, and they've experienced some significant declines recently, and it's had quite a considerable impact on our fishery. We operate a commercial fishery in that territory, and from previous community meetings, our community members from both Saugeen and Nawash have expressed their concerns about the whitefish and what's going on, and the need for us to really delve into those issues and learn more about them so that we can help them out. This is where this project came from. A lot of our research is community-based and guided by the community. So yeah, this is Together with Giigoonyag. This is a wonderful logo that one of our community members created for us. There's a lot of meaning in the different parts of the logo. You see the feathers up top there. There's 7 of them representing the 7 grandfather teachings, the eagles looking to the past and to the future. And I think the coolest thing about this is the 3 heads representing the 3 different entities involved. So like I said, the ministry, parks, and the Saugeen Ojibway Nation. And a defining characteristic of this research is using something called two-eyed seeing. So what that basically means is we're using and valuing Indigenous knowledge and Western science together. So Western science is when you think of science, your typical science, like testing hypotheses and stuff like that. And we're putting Indigenous knowledge, so knowledge from our community members, on the same level as Western science, and using both perspectives to get a more broader and holistic understanding of what's actually going on. And as you can see, there is the overlap with the eyes there with the different agencies. And yeah, I don't know, I think this logo is a nice representation of what we're trying to do. So within this research initiative, there are a number of different research projects focusing on different aspects of the fishery and whitefish in particular. So I have them listed on the side there, and for the purposes of this presentation, I'll just briefly explain the first 2. So the mapping, interviews, and the acoustic telemetry. And this initiative is scheduled for 5 years, so it began last year and it'll continue into 2025. Before I talk about those first 2 projects, I'd like to share this wonderful graphic that my colleague Caitlin Almack from the ministry created. It essentially just shows the space that we do our research in. So ethics are really important when doing research with people, and especially with Indigenous folks. There's been a history of extractive research in Indigenous communities with little to no benefit to the community themselves. So as we move forward with this research, this Together with Giigoonyag initiative and other research, we make sure to ground ourselves in an ethical space. So I'll just briefly go through the different sections of the circle here. So the big one is that the research is place-based and issue-focused. So the place is the Saugeen traditional territory, and the issue is lake whitefish declines and, you know, the overall ecosystem change we've been experiencing in Lake Huron. We recognize multiple ways of knowing. So that's, I have something there, Saugeen EK, so Saugeen Ojibway Nation based ecological knowledge. So that's that Indigenous perspective, and then Western science as well. You know, a lot of the work we do is guided by the community and elders, and you know, we always like to incorporate ceremony when we can to do this work in a good way. We have shared and meaningful goals between all of our partners. We have ongoing learning and engagement. We have a community-based advisory committee that is helping us to guide this research. And we do a lot of outreach and education in the community and the wider Saugeen Ojibway Nation territory. And then finally, mutual benefit and equitable partnerships. And you know, just making sure that the Saugeen as a nation is benefiting from this research, and it's being done in an ethical way. So sort of as the foundation for the Together with Giigoonyag initiative are a series of mapping interviews. And this is to collect and gather that Indigenous knowledge perspective. So what we do is we sit down with an individual, whether that be a fish harvester or a community member that's involved in the fishery in some way rather. And we ask them a series of questions, and it's semi-structured and quite informal. You know, it's more of a discussion. And as we talk about the fish and, you know, stories on the water, we'll map important locations in the territory, like spawning shoals, you know, feeding grounds for specific fish. And the focus of these interviews will be, of course, whitefish. And this knowledge will be used to inform the other aspects of the research and be used alongside Western science approaches. So, you know, this is the Indigenous knowledge perspective, and then we have more Western science heavy projects, and this will act to inform it. And one of those is acoustic telemetry. So I won't get into the I guess the technical side of acoustic telemetry, but where our community perspective and knowledge can come into play is identifying important locations where we can tag fish, and you know, certain locations that would be important with respect to telemetry. So Chris shared earlier a map with the planned acoustic telemetry work, and then this is our, I guess, our plan for our project. As you can see, we'll be implanting several hundred transmitters in fish, and I mentioned whitefish as our focus, but we'll also be tagging lake trout as well. So this is basically our breakdown year by year of what we'll be doing. So very excited. I think it's going to be awesome. The larger circles are areas where we've identified to maybe target some tagging efforts, but of course, all of the tagging efforts within the Saugeen traditional territory will be informed by our fish harvesters and community members. Chris already showed this map. An example, so we did some telemetry work in November. So we tagged 49 fish, and we installed two receivers. And before we did that, myself and my colleague Christopher Akwenzi sat down with some of our fish harvesters and just asked them to identify some important locations where we should target for this first round of telemetry. This was by no means one of those mapping interviews I spoke about earlier, more of like an informal discussion, like, hey, where should we do this first round of tagging? And they identified a location right off the shores of Nawash on a shoal that's important for whitefish. So, you know, we decided to start there. Those black dots represent where we set nets. So that was while whitefish were spawning. And then the triangle is a fairly large cement dock that we have where we did the surgeries and the release of the fish. And then, of course, those red circles are the two receivers that we installed. So that whole exercise was awesome. It was my first introduction into telemetry in practice, and I thought it was great. We started off this work with ceremony by Justin, who spoke at the beginning of this workshop, and it took us about a week to catch enough fish to tag. a big component of our work is involving the community as much as possible. So we hired a local fish harvester, Peter, and it was great because he brought his whole family out. He 3 of his kids he fished with, and it was great to see that, the father and children going out and fishing, and it was an awesome experience. I have just a video here of some of the whitefish that were caught. We used a bottom set gill net to catch these fish. Chris mentioned there were some issues with whitefish being not as hardy as other fish, but we only experienced one fish that died during our telemetry work. A couple weeks after we were done this work, and there was 49 fish in the water, 2 of them showed up in some of our commercial fish harvesters' nets. So, I mean, that just goes to show that they did survive for at least 2 weeks. So yeah, it'd be nice to, we have those receivers out there. So come spawning time this fall, we'll be able to see what, how many fish return to that specific site. So looking forward to that. And yeah, that's together with Giigoonyag and the Saugeen Ojibway Nation in a nutshell. I think we have some time for questions. Caitlin, do you want to?
Thanks, Alex, for sharing that collaborative project. Yeah, if anyone has questions, feel free to raise your hand or any questions of clarification for Alex or Janna. And we do have a couple of questions in the chat from this conversation. So one is learning about your perspective on the relationship between the co-production of knowledge and the two-eyed seeing approach.
Do you maybe want to answer that question, Caitlin, as part of the group?
I can try. So for me, I think if you're learning together, you're going to be generating new knowledge and insights. And that's a way of really applying the two-eyed seeing approach.
Yeah, I guess I can hop in. Yeah, so two-eyed seeing, I think, is using both perspectives to answer a question, and then or concern or to learn more, and then the co-production, novel information, but sharing information, and then the two-eyed seeing is using using both knowledges to do something. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's lots of people on the line. Oh, go ahead, Janna.
No, I was just gonna say, I can maybe give more of a personal perspective about how that is and how it is to watch that happen with the work that I do. I didn't say this in my introduction, but I think we have bios that are provided. So I am a member of the Chippewas of Nawash First Nation, very closely attached to my home community. My family is still there. Also have family in the Saugeen Nation as well. So for the work that I've been doing with the national park since 2015 and watching the evolution of how an organization, a federal government organization, has worked with the Saugeen Ojibway Nation over the time from where they were in 2015 to where they are today, it's pretty amazing. And a lot of the work that we've been doing in the last 2 years specifically has really started to focus on a two-eyed seeing approach, where it's not just working together, it's not just bringing two systems of knowledge together, but it's actually bringing the people who carry that knowledge together. And it's those people that actually make the relationship work. Without the people and without their heart into the work that they're doing and wanting to work together, these relationships can't happen successfully or effectively. So it really takes a lot of openness and trust. And you think of what the 7 grandfather teachings are, and we're employing all of those in some fashion without even thinking about it sometimes when we are choosing to work together and bring our knowledge systems together. And really, when we're bringing our knowledge systems together, we're continuing to learn. Our learning is lifelong. We learn from each other. You know, the Western side's learning from us. The non-Western side is learning from them. And together we're bringing something, you know, we're producing something unique that is going to benefit all of us. So I think that is a really, really big, important piece of how bringing two systems of knowledge together works and what it can do for your organization. Thank you.
Thank you, Janna. We have 2 questions related to the project, the telemetry project. So one is, how do the nets impact the spawning fish, and how do we minimize that? And do we tag whitefish in the winter, or when do we tag whitefish? So Alex, I'll let you answer those two questions.
For sure. So in that specific location we selected, when we were talking to fishermen, they identified the time range those fish would be spawning, and that was in late November. Based on previous harvests in that location, I know there was a couple individuals who were like, "Oh, you guys should go out this week." So we did, and they were spawning. Yeah, so with respect to gill nets, they are a little rough on fish. Generally, our fish harvesters would leave gill nets in for 24 hours and take them out the next day. However, with this one, just to minimize the stress on the fish, just because, you know, we catch them with the gill net, we bring them back to shore, we put them under with anesthetic MS-222, and then we make an incision in their stomach, put the tag in, and then put them back, and that's a lot of stress. So to minimize that, our sets were around 45 minutes to an hour with nets in the water, just to minimize the time they were in the gill net. You know, there has to be some level of stress that came from that, even though it wasn't a long time, but it's greatly reduced from, say, like a 24-hour set. So yeah.
Great, and there's another question relevant to the tagging. So if there's any side effects on the fish's physiology from the tag.
I don't know. Maybe that's a question for Chris Vandergoot to answer. I'm not too sure about that. I don't think so, but.
So I guess with physiology, it would be interesting to know if there's a specific aspect of that. Generally, we haven't seen like declines in growth rates or anything like that. These fish are fairly robust. I saw one of the fish swimming around the tank. It looked like it almost had a sea lamprey mark on it. You know, we've seen lake trout with 7 and 8 scars on them. So, you know, it's hard to say. It depends what metric you're measuring. I guess the fact that we see fish making the same movements, you know, maybe 4 years or so, and I would argue that there's probably some short-term effect, but I don't think it's, you know, lasting. Of course, if there is, that would completely invalidate our study. But any study, any tagging study has to deal with that to one level or another.
Okay, great. Are there any other questions that folks have? Okay, there's another one that came in. Is given the anesthetic use, are fish safe to eat? I guess, Alex, you can answer that.
Yeah, so when we tag the fish and put them under, we send out a community notice not to consume the fish that were tagged. And like Chris mentioned, there is a visible external tag on the fish that's easily identifiable. So we advised our community members not to consume those fish for a month after the tagging was done. And then, of course, like Chris also mentioned, there is a reward for returning the tag and those tagged fish. So in that community information letter we sent out, we said, you know, there is a reward for the fish, so please bring them back. And the 2 fish that were caught were brought back to us. So that was good. Oh, you can go ahead.
So recently we've been experimenting with using electricity. And if any of you have ever had a bad back and they've given you a TENS unit, it kind of stimulates the muscle, puts a very low electrical current. It's with a 9-volt battery. We've actually been using that fairly successfully to immobilize the fish, to do the surgery, and then to release them. And that's, you know, that the reason we like that, it's a no chemical approach. But that may not work well for the study, you know, certain organisms or for whatever you're trying to accomplish. That is one of the things that we certainly are addressing from a public health standpoint. So there, again, that's another potential or benefit of working with other GLATOS folks, just to help say, hey, how are you doing this and what might work for my circumstances?
Great. So we did have a question come in regarding aquaculture. I know we have time at the end of the session for general questions, but considering we have a few minutes, Emilio, feel free to unmute yourself. If not, I will read out your question. So it says, I've assisted a First Nation to establish a farm and I'm interested in arriving at my own license in the future. I'm also interested in offering project managed water quality monitoring baseline data for the aquaculture industry. I think there would be a good opportunity to promote effort on my part as well. And the related question is about commercial aquaculture and telemetry and how they can participate. So considering we have 4 minutes, I thought Christy might be able to answer that before our next ARFRC question.
Sure. I wasn't sure how this was going to play out. So Emilio, I think I did send you a response in the chat. And I also would mention, if anybody would like to contact me, don't hesitate. I left my email in the chat there. So actually in Europe, there's quite a bit of collaboration with the aquaculture industry and researchers using telemetry to get an idea of, like, say, how many fish are escaping, if these net pens, and I believe that's what you're referring to, Emilio, is the net pen aquaculture, is that correct? Okay, so, you know, do these net pens act as, I think they refer to them as bird feeders? Like, do other fish, are they attracted to them, and what potential implications does that have? So I don't know that there are any projects on the Great Lakes that certainly would be a potential use of it. That's a hard one too, because you'd have to sit down and say, are those fish naturally coming here because these net pens were put into an area where they just historically would move through, or are they in fact being attracted to here? And then, so I think there are opportunities, but as I referred to Emilio, we don't like to drive research. We like to help researchers answer those questions. So if that were a question that the managers or industry had, that would be something, you know, we certainly could provide the technical expertise to help address.
If I could jump in, Chris, I guess one of the things that I've noticed is there is a trend for a lot of research to be conducted in First Nation communities and in and around, you know, the North Channel, Lake Huron, as well as Lake Superior. And so that is going to be research that's, you know, baseline data that's taking place in the next, you know, several years. And I think there's opportunity there to capture some of that data before an actual farm comes into, you know, fulfillment, and then the opportunity afterwards just to monitor that and to collect that data and to end up at, I guess, some conclusions, I guess, would be where my head is at. And then, you know, again, looking at, you know, over time, you know, I know there are existing projects. We might not be able to capture the baseline data beforehand, but you might be able to see a trend if you're monitoring over, you know, a 10 or 15-year period of time. So I think there's opportunity there. I just was wondering, you know, how one might get involved. Maybe a farm, you know, may be interested in that data because then they can boast it, I guess, in their, or maybe they won't be, you know, not so much, but they might want to participate. They might not want to from the cost perspective. But they might want to participate because they already have the resources out there and they're already bringing in crews to do the data collection. So why not, you know, contribute to any study work that's going on? It's a tough sell, but, you know, maybe they might be interested in that.
So just as full disclosure, I was a manager for 15 years in Ohio, so I'm very sensitive to managers being told to do something. So I certainly don't want to tread on that border. A comparable situation, I think what you're talking about is that in Ohio, they were proposing to put a wind farm up on Lake Erie and said, great, we want to collect some pre-impact potential data. So we actually put receivers through the area to monitor how fish were moving through this area prior to construction, and then how that may have changed after construction. So it seems to me that this would perhaps be a similar opportunity or circumstance. But again, I throw that to again, it is at the discretion of the managers and whatever. But yeah, I could see some type of potential there.
Awesome. All right. Well, I guess we'll move on to our next presentation from Aireal Starr, who works for the Anishinabek Ontario Fisheries Resource Center. Take it away, Aireal.
Okay. And do you see my presentation?
Looks great. Awesome.
All right, so Ani Bojo, Gagi Gashigakwe, Indigenous, Biktigang Anishinabek, Indonjaba, Nabizing, Indonda, Mos, Dodem. Good morning, everyone. My name is Aireal Starr, and I work for the Anishinabek Ontario Fishery Resource Center, located here in North Bay. So a little bit about me. My name is Aireal. My home community is Biktigang Anishinabek, located in the Northern Superior region. I've completed my Bachelor of Science with a double major biology and psychology at Western, and then I joined with the OFRC as a part of their internship program, where that eventually led to where I am now, which is a fisheries technician. I've been with the OFRC for about 5 years now, and it has brought me all over the place and completing many different projects, and also some very exciting ones like acoustic telemetry. So a little bit about the Anishinabek Ontario Fishery Resource Center. So we serve as an independent source of information on fisheries assessments, conservation, and management to 39 First Nations communities within the Anishinabek Nation. We serve a lot of communities that surround Lake Huron and Georgian Bay. Communities would approach our organization with a question or concern for a specific species or water body, and our talented staff would work with that community to best answer their question. So the AFRC has been around since 1995 and has always strived to be the center of excellence for fisheries assessment and management, recognized and trusted by First Nations, governments, and all users of fishery resource. We promote state-of-the-art technology, and technology. So we have done previous radio telemetry work in the Northern Superior region, and just doing this type of work, it has led us to working with acoustic telemetry. So as you know, acoustic telemetry allows for fish tracking and movement using transmitters and receivers. Transmitters are acoustic tags that are surgically implanted in the fish or externally attached, depending on the project. And receivers are data logging computers deployed near the bottom of a lake or river. Acoustic tags send out pings into the water when it is near a deployed receiver. That fish is identified with an ID code in the tag, and the date and time are recorded. The AFRC has undertaken acoustic telemetry projects, and one of those have been in partnership with Garden River First Nation, located in the Lake Huron region. This 3-year project had to do with spawning and overwintering movements of Lake Sturgeon in the Garden and St. Mary's rivers. The study objectives of this project were to confirm Lake Sturgeon spawning activity on the Garden River. The spawning sites were informed by community members and a completion of a habitat survey. Drift netting was completed to capture larval Lake Sturgeon as well. Another major objective was to evaluate the movement patterns of Lake Sturgeon during their spawning migration and throughout the year. This was accomplished using an acoustic telemetry approach. The project was conducted on the Garden River, which is highlighted in the red, and in the St. Mary's River systems as well. The AOFRC captured Lake Sturgeon around the mouth of the river, around the mouth of the Garden River. During the course of the project, we were able to tag a total of 59 sturgeon with Vemco V16 transmitters. We tagged 17 in 2016, 22 in 2017, and 20 in 2018. These tags were surgically implanted into the abdomens of the lake sturgeon. All the sturgeon were biologically sampled and released. The team took note of length, width, and girth measurements. They also clipped the fin for genetic analysis and took a pectoral fin ray for age determination. In addition to the acoustic tags, a pit tag and a Floyd tag were also inserted into the lake sturgeon. Another note is that the fish that were captured weren't all in spawning condition. So this suggests that they also use this as a feeding habitat. So the OFRC has put out 12 receivers for this project, And we are part of the GLATOS network, which is a binational group of researchers who collaboratively use acoustic telemetry to study fish movement and behavior in the Great Lakes. So we were able to utilize receivers that were put out by USGS and DFO to further track the fish movement that we have tagged. And the configuration of these receivers has changed like since the project has started, just to improve the way we monitor the fish. So as you can see labeled on the map, I've highlighted two areas, which are the rapids and the waterfalls. So these are the known locations for spawning. In 2019, we had a total of 59 sturgeon that have been tagged, and 11 were picked up at the rapids, and 3 were also picked up at the waterfalls, suggesting that they went up that far. On a side note, in 2018, the water levels were very high at that point when we placed them in. And then then the water levels became too low, so the receivers weren't even in the water at that point. So that's why there was no detections during that time. For 2020, due to the COVID pandemic, we weren't able to place the receivers at the rapids, but we did have one at the falls, which had no detections as well. Okay, so next, using acoustic telemetry, we were able to determine their overwintering movements and have found that most of the lake sturgeon that spawn in the Garden River are year-round residents. So these 4 graphs here, so this is an Atticus plot. Each of those graphs are different fish. So the x-axis is for the time or dates, and then the y-axis is a different receiver arrays or groups of receivers in a particular location. So here I've highlighted in yellow, which is the St. Mary's River system. And then in the red, highlighted the Lake George arrays, which are labeled LKJ and DCK. So looking at the top left plot, in the spring and early summer, the fish was detected in the Lake George array and the St. Mary's River array, suggesting that this fish was moving between those sites during that time. And interestingly enough, when the fall and winter time approached, the sturgeon were detected solely in Lake George, meaning that the sturgeon stayed there during the winter. Yeah, so that's what these graphs are showing, and the pattern was detected in 32 of the 38 sturgeon that we have tagged in 2017 and 2018. Some other findings that we also discovered was that the sturgeon avoid the shipping routes. So ships pass through Lake Nicollet, and we found that majority of the fish did not go through there. And if they did go through there, they were going at a very rapid pace compared to the leisurely pace that they would take between St. Mary's and Lake George. Another finding was that no lake sturgeon moved through the Sioux locks. They have the capability to, but they just chose to not go past or go up the locks. So specifically for this project, the OFRC will continue to retrieve and redeploy receivers until those acoustic tags in the fish expire, which is about 6 years and up to 10. And then we also are looking for possible collaboration with DFO, MNRF, USFWS, and others to tag lake sturgeon throughout the St. Mary's River system, which will be a more comprehensive assessment. So the Garden River was a project, the Garden River First Nation was an example of the capabilities and knowledge that we can find out about fish movement and to better protect our fisheries and working with other collaborators and partners. So our organization right now is currently taking on an acoustic telemetry project within the Anishinabek Nation. We are working in partnership with Giigoonyag located in the Northern Superior region. And we will be studying on a river system within their traditional territories to study fish movement and habitat utilization. So the development of the array in Lake Huron and Georgian Bay will allow for projects to be developed and more opportunities to gain knowledge and insight into fisheries. So feel free to reach out to me if you need help with project planning. Our organization does do letters of intent, which are due in the early fall, and we can assist with helping with project development as well for communities within the Anishinabek Nation.
Awesome. Thanks, Aireal. That was great. I think we have some questions in the chat there.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Aireal. So one of our questions is, when you're designing a project, how do you determine how many fish to tag or what fish species to tag?
That's all dependent on what the community wants, so it needs to be specific. Yeah, and depending on the cost of the project and the tags, because it can be pretty pricey as well.
Great. Another question we had was regarding the sturgeon project. What were some of the most interesting findings that the community found through that project?
Well, I guess just that most of the sturgeon are year-round residents, and they typically don't go out into Lake Huron, and only a handful have left that area, whereas they've all stayed in that area.
I have a question. How do you share the findings from this telemetry work with the communities you work with?
So our organization, we work with the communities and we work for that community. So we don't share any data or any information that like everything's there. So we have to let them know what we're going to be sharing.
Cool. Another question, I actually had a question as well. How do you work with the community and knowledge keepers to inform your study?
So I guess like we just go into the communities and ask them. It's all project dependent on what we're doing. So for example, with like we'd work with First Nations community, and more than likely they would complete like a TAK assessment. So just gaining that knowledge there, and then that would be their data that they would share. Yeah.
Great. And then one question was about the sturgeon, because I know you mentioned you found out that they were stationary in your study. So are they not migratory, or did the understanding change through the study?
So they migrate up to their spawning grounds, but they just typically stay there year round, we found.
Great. That's so interesting. Thank you so much for sharing that study. Does anyone else have any questions for ARFRC or clarification?
I have a question.
Go ahead, Roger. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Roger Rose. Would the Ottawa River or like say Lake Temiskaming, like I know you've done the Great Lakes, but has that ever been set up like what you guys are doing to monitor the fish in that area?
As far as
especially
I know,
with the dams,
yeah.
Like, I guess the dams would.
As far as I know, I don't believe that there are any acoustic receivers set up in like Nipissing area. So like our organization, we work all over Ontario basically. So Yeah, and currently right now, the acoustic telemetry is primarily focused in the Great Lakes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I see we have one more question that came in, I guess directed to ARFRC, is when are you going to announce this year's projects? I assume that's related to your organization.
Yeah, so we'll just be in contact with each individual First Nations that we work with.
Hang tight.
Yeah.
Okay, any other questions of clarification or about ARFRC or the different project ideas? I feel like we got such a diverse range of projects. I personally have so many different ideas of things that I can learn about around the lake.
Yeah, it's great. And especially like working with other organizations, working with other collaborators to make the projects more worthwhile is awesome.
Okay, awesome. Well, we'll take a 10-minute break right now. I guess we'll come back at 10:57, 11-ish. Maybe we'll start the next presentation at 11. So if you guys can be back for 11, I'll play a slideshow just of some images from our previous telemetry work, just for those to watch, and we'll reconvene in about 10 minutes. Welcome back, everyone. Hopefully everyone's at their computer and ready to go. I'd like to introduce our final presenter, Kelli Paige from the Great Lakes Observing System. You can take it away, Kelli.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks, everyone, for the opportunity to come and speak to you all today. I'm excited to share this vision for Smart Great Lakes that we have, and hopefully it resonates with you. So as Alex mentioned, my name is Kelli Paige, and I'm the CEO of the Great Lakes Observing System. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization incorporated in the US. We were established to support data collection, data management, and data sharing in the Great Lakes. So we essentially serve as one of 11 regions of a federal program on the US side called the IOOS program, or Integrated Ocean Observing System. And around 2006, the IOOS program was established, recognizing that there were all these different US federal agencies that were collecting data and doing monitoring in the oceans, along the coast, and in the Great Lakes. And shouldn't these agencies be coordinating their activities with one another, sharing the data with each other, and making sure that that data was, available to, anyone who wanted to use it, for decision-making purposes. And so the program was established. NOAA is the lead federal agency on the US side, but as I mentioned, it's a partnership of many different agencies. Their logos are listed at the bottom of the slide. And we serve as a regional node of that federal program, essentially helping to leverage all of that partnership and coordination that's happening at the federal level, and making sure that our local stakeholders are also engaged. So if you think about universities that collect data, state agencies, of course, in the Great Lakes, all of our Canadian partners as well. So making sure that whatever standards, protocols, coordination that can happen is happening in the region, and also helping people to share that data in ways that they're comfortable. There's also a Canadian IOOS program. Currently, it does not operate in the Great Lakes, so we're helping to represent Canadians here at GLOS as well. There's a Pacific, Atlantic, and St. Lawrence River area within the Canadian IOOS program. So specifically, we use funding that we receive from the federal government to support various monitoring efforts and observing efforts. So that can include deploying equipment like buoys, or really just any other types of monitoring equipment. We also help to support the ability to manage data and share it, make it accessible over the web or to other various stakeholders. And then finally, any applications, tools, visualizations, other ways of interpreting and analyzing the data so that it can be used by managers and decision makers for various purposes. Originally, when the organization started, I think, maybe the thought was, well, this will be a way to help scientists and researchers, make their data available to the public or to broader audiences. But over time, we noticed a few trends. First, as the ability to access more and more data became prevalent, we found that people were asking more complex questions and requiring more sophisticated analysis of the type of data that was out there, really turning that data into information to address some major challenges that are facing the Great Lakes region and long-term sustainability of the region. And then we also noticed another trend that more and more people prefer to receive information in these sort of passive ways. So they like to get a text alert or an email notification if something, really interesting is happening, rather than, going to a website every day and checking the information or, checking the news, so to speak, on a website. They prefer to really have that information just delivered to them in a more passive way. So as we were, looking to update some of our tools and resources, we thought to ourselves, we really want to make it very easy for people to be able to contribute data or access data in the, changing ways that, we were seeing in these trends over time. And so we've been working on developing an information technology platform that will really allow for people to share data and access data in the complex ways that we've been noticing. So, just accommodating people at different technology levels and, being mindful of maybe security interests or complex processing and visualization needs, making sure that the data can be easily interoperable with the various systems and ways that people want to access it. So, we're really trying to accommodate all the ways that data exists in this data to information lifecycle, and making sure that we can help people share and access their data as easily as possible. Also, over time, we noticed that just like acoustic telemetry, tells us so much about the fisheries that we may not be able to learn otherwise, there's a lot of potential in this advancing technology, and how can we use it to our advantage to really help us improve our understanding of the Great Lakes. So this idea that, there are all of these smart sensors, smartphones, even your refrigerator can be smart, all these different ways of collecting data. How could we apply that to the Great Lakes and make sure that we were really taking advantage of all the technology advances that are out there and utilizing, all the data and information that could potentially be at our fingertips. So that's really how this vision for Smart Great Lakes came to be and what inspired the idea behind Smart Great Lakes, really trying to make sure that we had the best data and information at our disposal to make data-driven decisions about how we manage and use the lakes. And I guess I just want to pause a little bit as well in thinking about the notion of the word smart. I think it can probably have a lot of different interpretations or definitions. And, obviously Smart Great Lakes is sort of biased towards the technology-driven interpretation, but I also like to think about the word smart. You know, one of my favorite phrases is work smarter, not harder, right? And so to me, the notion of working smarter is really researching and learning, you know, all the different approaches, methodologies, tools, technologies that are available to you, and thinking about which strategies you can employ to be as efficient and effective in getting to your goals as possible. So to this end, you know, we're really seeking that knowledge and those opportunities to make sure that, you know, our work to making the Great Lakes a safe and healthy and thriving resource benefits from, you know, as many approaches, methodologies, and different ways of being smart as possible. You know, really trying to improve the efficiency and impact of our management and research in the Great Lakes. So, well, and actually I should take a step back here. So really, you know, we see that GLOS obviously has an opportunity to support this vision of Smart Great Lakes, because we do support, you know, through funding, different monitoring and data management and data delivery projects. But really, in order to have a Smart Great Lakes, it really should be bigger than just one organization, the Great Lakes Observing System, right? So we've been working over the past year to 18 months to build a Smart Great Lakes initiative, which is really a partnership of many different organizations across the Great Lakes region who all share this common goal of improving the way we learn about and respond to lake events through these smart approaches. So there are a lot of potential outcomes. Right now we're working on developing a common strategy document, which will help us identify those smart strategies, the ways that, you know, we all see collaboratively being able to better understand and utilize the Great Lakes as a resource. But there are a lot of potential outcomes that can come from this effort, including supporting evaluation metrics, helping deliver information products, helping groups adopt best practices, obviously advancing innovation in science and information technology, and then maybe one that's more directed towards my job, which is advocating for additional investment in things like monitoring infrastructure, additional research, and other needs that we have in order to help us better understand the lakes. And so I hope that this idea of Smart Great Lakes resonates with you. And I would be interested to know if, you know, just conceptually, you see that there might be opportunities for your interest to benefit under a framework like this. And if so, I would encourage you to consider participating on a committee through the Smart Great Lakes Initiative to help us further explore, you know, what this idea could, you know, this notion of Smart Great Lakes and how we might develop strategies that are as inclusive and efficient and effective as possible. So we do, as an organization, provide funding to support, like I said, various aspects of data collection, data management, and data sharing. Typically, the resources that we have available are used to purchase equipment, to support any data management, database development, you know, the people, the hardware, the software that you need to manage the data. Obviously, through tools like GLATOS and the GLATOS website, encouraging people to find ways to share data and information with others so that we can all benefit from the information that's being derived. And then we also support the development of different information tools or applications to help people interpret, understand, and access the data. We recently had a mini grant funding opportunity. The focus of that mini grant was geared towards making sure that various monitoring programs out there could be easily compatible with our new information technology platform that I described earlier. But we got a ton of great project proposals from that funding opportunity. And so we're trying to connect as many of them as we can to other funding streams that we're able to access through the U.S. federal program that we're a part of. And I just listed 3 examples of projects that we're planning on funding either through the mini grant opportunity that we just released or in future funding streams that are going to be made available. And I anticipate, I don't have a specific timeline on when we'll be doing more mini grant funding opportunities, but I anticipate that we will have more in the future. And really at any time, if you had an idea for a monitoring project or a data sharing challenge that you were coming up against and you wanted to connect with us, you should just feel free to reach out at any time. Just as a heads up, usually the grant funding that we're able to provide does typically have a certain focus. So sometimes it's on a specific type of monitoring technology. Sometimes it's on a specific type of data or information tool. So that might influence some of the funding opportunities that we have in the future. But I would definitely encourage anyone who is looking for some resources to help get a monitoring project off the ground or to help improve ways of managing or sharing the data to reach out to us at any time. And then I've just listed my contact and my colleague, Katie Rousseau, who helps us organize the Smart Great Lakes Initiative. Again, feel free to contact us. And if you want to learn more about the Smart Great Lakes Initiative, you can check out our website.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Kelly. That was great. It's always good to learn about stuff like that. I think we had couple questions maybe comments there.
Yeah, there's one question in the chat for you, Kelly, and then if anyone else has any questions, feel free to raise their hand. So the question is, how can Indigenous communities, so tribes, First Nations, and I guess Métis, get involved, and how can they apply for funding to pursue a project? What would be the next steps?
Right, so I would say probably at this stage, contact us and let us know about the projects that you're interested in developing, and we can work with you to find an appropriate funding stream to support that project. But I would also say, stay on our contact list. You can go sign up for our newsletter and learn more about funding opportunities as they're announced. It's hard to say, or it's hard to anticipate right now if there will be specific funding opportunities for acoustic telemetry per se, but certainly there's a wide variety of different monitoring technologies that are supported, and I'm certain that one will be relevant, or that there will be some that are relevant to the monitoring interests that you guys have. So we can make it flexible.
Would you maybe be able to talk about some of those other monitoring technologies or methods?
Sure. So, and I probably should have done that in my presentation a little bit more. So primarily we support a pretty extensive network of monitoring buoys. So that was one of the photos that I showed earlier. We also support networks of sensors that are typically placed maybe in like permanent platforms. So for example, in Lake Erie, there's a series of water quality sensors that are put at water intake pipes for drinking water facilities. We also support gliders and other autonomous underwater vehicles that are essentially like remote control type vehicles that can be used to monitor the lakes at different depths and move across the lake so that you're not necessarily just at a fixed location. And we're also trying to work towards more under ice observing systems. So cabled networks where there's like a station on shore and a cable that runs along the lake floor, the lake bed with sensors connected to it so that we can get more year-round monitoring, because that's actually one of the major gaps for the Great Lakes is under ice monitoring. So yeah, so there's a lot of different, right in the past 4 years, there's been an increase in funding for the autonomous vehicles and other gliders and remote vehicles like that. I'm not sure, the funding priorities tend to change with presidential administration, so it's still a little bit uncertain right now what the priorities for the new administration will be, but we're anticipating that a lot of it will be climate focused, just because that was a priority for the Biden administration when they were campaigning on the US side. So we expect to see a lot more funding opportunities targeted at long-term monitoring programs in particular.
Great. Are there any other questions for Kelli or about the Great Lakes Observing System? Just give people a couple of seconds to see if there's any questions. If not, we can open it up for general questions with all of our presenters, because that was what we're going to do next. Yeah, thanks so much for a great presentation, Kelli. So yeah, we'll just invite all of our presenters. So Janna and Alex, Chris, Aireal, Kelli, and see if there's any other questions that we wanted to discuss, or anyone want to share what they see the opportunities being working with these technologies with First Nation and Métis communities on Lake Huron. Oh, Roger, I see your hand. Go ahead.
Well, I'd really like to thank you guys for your presentation. I learned more here in a couple hours than I did with the Great Lakes government people that presented their thing on the Great Lakes, and you guys have really showed us that you're really monitoring. The only thing I can see, if we could keep this monitoring part up, is do the Ottawa River also, and then we find out how the fish, I think the sturgeon, like when you look at that sturgeon, excuse me, I remember talking with elders in the community about the sturgeon in the Ottawa River. There used to be in Mattawa a place where they collected those sturgeon and the caviar and stuff, and now there's none because of the power dams that are down along the river. There's very few sturgeon, so this would be a good project, I think, to get into and look at some of the other major rivers that we've used or someone has used. But thanks very much for your presentation. It was very, very educational.
Thank you so much. Maybe I'll get Aireal to answer that, because you have the most experience with designing studies such as those.
I guess, well, like our organization, we work within the Anishinabek Nation, and we have been a part of like other applications in working with other parties. So it would really have to, somebody would have to come to us asking for a project to be done, like on the Ottawa River. So one of the communities that we work for.
Okay, thanks. There's another question that has come in regarding the telemetry study. So are the receivers planned for Georgian Bay going in this spring or summer?
Yes, that's the plan. I know Chris Davis is on the call. I don't know if you want to talk about the plan for this year, Chris, if you're.
Yeah, sure. So it's a collaborative process. So there will be the three partners that are on the Together with Giigoonyag project would be doing some receivers each, and the plan is to do Georgian Bay. Off the top of my head, I think we got 40. I'm going to say 42 or 43 receivers planned for Georgian Bay right now, and that's kind of the highest priority because we've got some fish tagged there. So we're hoping to do those, starting in a few weeks here. We're getting a little bit more complicated with the current shutdowns in Ontario, but that's the plan is to go ahead with that pretty soon here. We get typically calmer weather sort of during late May and early June. And then, we've got to talk with among the partners to try and figure out, we think we can cover, Georgian Bay and then a significant piece of geography somewhere else. So whether we try and do the main basin this year or do the North Channel, those are some decisions yet to be made. But we'll definitely get Georgian Bay covered before too long.
Yeah, and when we are putting the tags in the fish, we will be notifying the various First Nations and Métis communities and the geography so that you guys will know what's happening and going on with that project. We'll be in touch when we are doing the fish surgeries. Is there any other questions you can ask anyone? Amelia, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering, if there was an uptick of, the GLATOS project out by the sanctuary, the lake trout sanctuary near, I guess it would be like below the Mississauga Straits there. And, what kind of data is coming out of that study? And, is there information from that that can assist some of the, the people that are studying the whitefish decline? And is there a correlation, I guess, to say? Much.
Thanks, Emilio. So that's a question related to a particular geography. So I would say from MNRF side, I would call on Arunas, maybe. I know he's on the line, or Chris, to answer that question about the lake trout sanctuary at the base of the Mississauga River. And if there's any implications regarding telemetry.
Great, Mississauga Strait.
Straight, yeah, sorry. I need to learn my geography more. So yeah, Chris or Arunas, do you want to try to answer that question? Or I know Aaron is also on the line, who's familiar with that geography.
Yeah, what's the sanctuary you're talking about there, Emilio? You mean the one out off the is it the Drummond Island Refuge or the Grand Bank one?
The Drummond Island one. I couldn't put my name on, or my mind on the name of the island. I know there's
sure.
A few islands there. Yeah, Copenhagen.
Yeah, so there's quite a bit of telemetry done there. Is that the project you're talking about? The it was through its U.S. waters, the sanctuary that's there. There's nothing on the Canadian side, so it's there was some really detailed telemetry. Some of the and Chris Vandergoot may know more about that project than I do. Like I said, it was mostly U.S. waters, but they were looking at the mapping out specific spawning sites.
I guess where my head was at was, I want to be able to understand where are they going, where are the fish going afterwards, and how is that affecting spawning areas in other jurisdictions? Because there seems to be a decline in whitefish all across the Lake Huron, and I know the species is predatory, and one of the things that I've seen in some of the projects I participated in is that there's a lot less whitefish juveniles that are out there, and there's some thought that the predation that's occurring is because there's a lot more lake trout out there, and you know, they're feasting. So just, you know, question.
Yeah.
I thought I'd
No, it's a great question. I mean, that's the fundamental part of this project. Well, the project we're working on together with Giigoonyag project is about lake trout, lake whitefish interactions. We're focusing on the whitefish movements and stuff a little bit more because there's other things, concerns about whitefish. And then we plan to be putting tags in lake trout in the same places we're tagging whitefish. Not all the places we're tagging whitefish maybe, but in a subset, to look at those movements of both lake trout and lake whitefish, and, you know, coming from the same places, how much overlap are we seeing, and some of the interactions that way. It's going to be a big part of the Indigenous knowledge part, asking for, you know, information about what people know about those interactions there as well. So the Drummond Island one, there wasn't a lake-wide array setup. That was really just specifically focused on the spawning areas within that refuge. And there wasn't, this is one of the things that's, you know, come along now with this project, is having that broad lake-wide array where we can start to ask some of these questions. And one of the reasons for the, you know, the current meeting here is just to try and, you know, maybe stimulate some thinking and see if there's other partnerships and things that we can get involved. So all good questions. I see Chris has got his hand up.
Yeah, Chris.
Yeah, Chris, you did a really good job summarizing it. What the Drummond Island study did is really provide fine scale. That was like what we call a VPS. Like, where did the wild fish that were tagged, where did they spawn relative to the hatchery origin fish, right? Because the hatchery origin fish have their adipose fins clipped. So they actually went out and collected those two different cohorts, tagged them, and looked at the spawning behaviors of those, the timing and things like that. So that provided a lot of really good fine resolution. What was interesting is now it's like, well, what were these things doing the other 6 or 7 or 8 months out of the year when they were not near these receivers because they had shifted their distribution? So that's exactly why we've kind of gone to this, you know, can we cover a whole Great Lake with these acoustic receivers? I remember when we first started talking about this, like, they thought we were nuts. I was like, well, just try it. And because like Lake Erie walleye swim a lot, we're like, well, we're definitely going to see them. And so I think we're starting to see more and more of that. So I think the upcoming studies are going to provide a lot more on the spatial coverage. And the other beautiful thing about this is you can now ask questions that you weren't necessarily thinking that you were going to ask, but because the infrastructure is already there, you can ask those questions. So even if you're only concerned about the spawning activity and phenology, you can also look at things like survival in other areas of the lake. And so again, it's the collaboration and utilizing the receivers. So we're getting there. And I think this is an awesome example of what we're starting to think now is looking at tagging predators and prey. It used to be that we were tagging predators, the bigger fish, because those were easy. Now we're able to start tagging the prey, the gobies, the bloaters, and things like that. And so I think those are going to be the really cool studies, is when you start looking at the predators and preys and looking at the spatial and temporal overlap of those to kind of address some of these concerns.
I see Aaron's hands up.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to touch briefly on the question about the effects of lake trout on lake whitefish, and just add a little bit that we do have another project that we're working on together. So Saugeen Ojibway Nation with the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry and some academic partners to look very specifically at that issue of how lake trout could be affecting lake whitefish. And this was, you know, an issue really brought to us by community members, that this was like a major concern and one of the top priority questions to address. So we are doing some diet analysis and some stable isotope work, as well as doing the Indigenous knowledge interviews as well to look specifically at that. And then the telemetry work is sort of another part to addressing that as well. And then just very quickly also wanted to mention we're doing some additional work as part of the Together with Giigoonyag project, not related to telemetry, but looking at how other factors may be contributing to declines of recruitment in lake whitefish as well. mainly looking at the food web changes that have gone on in the lake, stemming from the establishment of dry cinnid mussels and some of the climate change that's happened and how that might be influencing recruitment as well.
Thanks, Erin. There's one question of clarification from the chat, which is what fish do we refer to when we say lake trout? So maybe someone could clarify lake trout and lake trout stocking and what lake trout is in Lake Huron. Erin, do you want to try that?
Yeah, I don't know if this is specific to me or maybe more like for Alex as well, from like an Indigenous community perspective. I don't know, Alex, if you want to, do you know what I'm getting at?
Yeah, so with lake trout, there's obviously a stocking program in Lake Huron. And for our community, I know for our fish harvesters in particular, there's a real discernible difference between wild lake trout and then those that are stocked, especially in the territory. You know, the lake trout that get stocked in our territory or that were stocked in our territory came from elsewhere. The strains weren't native. So there's been some issues on a community level about those fish, just given that they're not essentially natural to the area. So yeah, I guess when we're talking about lake trout, it's either stocked lake trout or the wild lake trout that are native to that area. I hope that answers that question.
So that's really interesting, because in Lake Erie, we're doing a very similar thing. Is when we tag these fish, we actually took a genetic sample, and because we have the hatchery records, we're able to tie them back to a specific strain. And so, you know, that is another, you know, added value of some of these studies is like, okay, do we really know what we're tagging? And so whether it's stocked or not stocked is pretty clear if an adipose fin is clipped, but when you have that circumstance where there are different strains or different origins, it may be more difficult to parse that out. And so that's where some of these technologies can kind of work together to address those questions.
So you're taking a DNA sample when you're taking the fish?
Yep, just a fin. Yep, just a fin clip.
We do have some of that work as well going on in Lake Huron. So to be able to genetically identify basically what the strain of the parents that produced any given fish. And yeah, just adding to what Alex was stating, we do have different strains that are stocked into Lake Huron. Some of the strains are from Lake Huron itself, but then there's some other strains as well. So getting at some of these strain differences and movement and that kind of thing would be a great part of this work if we can get to that eventually. Sort of our focus initially is on lake whitefish, but yeah, we are planning on expanding the study to look at lake trout, and so that's where I think we can start thinking about if we want to look at stocked versus wild lake trout, which obviously would be really important work to do.
Great, thanks, Erin. A question like Alex and I wanted to ask everyone on the line. I see a lot of familiar names listed there, but about any potential interests or thoughts or ideas that you may have as Indigenous communities get more involved in studies like this. Like, what do we think the opportunities are? I know this is just a general question. I don't want to pick on anyone, but does anyone on the line, Keith or like Peter or anyone want to share anything as we just finish up this conversation about what you see the opportunities are? If not, that's okay too.
Well, maybe just to give people some time to think about that, I can tell you what the opportunities are from these type of projects and what they can expand into. Like I said before, I work for Parks Canada, and when I began working for Parks Canada, the relationship between our agency, the agency that I work for, and the Saugeen Ojibway Nation was very, very strained. And it was difficult to find a path forward on anything, really. What really began to change the way we were able to work together and the way we were able to begin to understand each other was finding projects that we both had interests in. So one of the huge stepping stones in the curve of the evolution of our relationship between Parks Canada and Saugeen Ojibway Nation was the Cisco Research Project. And the Cisco Research Project brought together team members from Parks Canada and members from Saugeen Ojibway Nation in a project that was much like Together with Giigoonyag, going to benefit us mutually. And what that did is the change that I saw in our organization was amazing. I would talk about it, and it would be difficult to get out because it was emotional to see that type of change happening, and it was emotional for the staff to hear about it as well. Where at one point in time, there would have never even been conversations happening between our staff and members of our Sun community. But as a result of the work together in the Cisco project, we had staff members, non-Indigenous staff members from our site boarding commercial fishing tugs from members of the Sun communities, working together and, just getting to know each other and building relationships. And those types of opportunities aren't always easy to find, and they need to happen organically too. You can't force that type of relationship to develop. And it was a stepping stone to finding more ways that we can work together. So after that, we studied alvars together. We are studying whitefish together now. We're also doing a project where we're going to be studying black bears together. And what it did is it really opened up the door to Parks Canada, particularly, to be open to what you can gain from traditional knowledge systems, whether you refer to them as Indigenous knowledge systems or otherwise. In our area, we call them Sun knowledge systems because that is where we are in the Saugeen Ojibway Nation. It really helped with the relationship. It really helped the understanding when you can actually see something in practice unfolding. When you can hear your colleagues or see your colleagues learning and having it affect them. So these opportunities, they may start as a collaborative research project that is very specific to one item that you're looking at, but it can really expand. It can really help build relationships. It can really help bridge communications and really, in meaningful ways, bring two different worldviews together.
Awesome. Well said, Janna. Thanks.
I see in the chat, Keith has a comment about a potential study regarding migration along the North Channel. So with whitefish or walleye or spawning tributaries along the North Shore of Lake Huron. I don't know if Keith, you're able to unmute to elaborate, but yeah, that does sound like an interesting potential for telemetry in that movement. Or if any of our presenters, such as Chris Vandergoot, if you have any comments about like a migration study and how that may play into GLATOS.
Well, what I was kind of interested in, and kind of what we've done here, is like, it sounds like the tribal partners have some ideas of where these fish historically spawned, and so testing that, by putting receivers in those areas, even if it's just one, for presence absence during the spawning periods, that would be like a fairly simple thing to do. We were testing in Lake Erie, like where lake trout historically spawned, to see if that's where they're currently spawning. And so that would be a great opportunity to kind of blend the two, to say, okay, this is where people think they're spawning, where they historically spawned. Of the fish we tagged, are they still spawning there, or do they actually spawn there? So that's just, that to me would seem like a very straightforward way of blending the two information sources.
So Chris, if people are interested in a specific project, would you recommend they maybe reach out to GLATOS just to discuss, or?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, talk is cheap, right? And you get what you pay for, and we're not going to charge you anything. But it might be good to get the ball rolling. Our funding for projects goes through the Great Lakes Fishery Commission. They're reviewed by the Board of Technical Experts and so on. So I don't just fund projects, out of the blue, but I can work with individuals, for going for seeking funding from a variety of sources, and there's opportunities for GLATOS to provide in-kind contributions, like for some receivers or something like that, depending upon what the needs are, or if it's expertise in tagging or something like that. So yeah, I mean, we can talk and help start laying things out if researchers think that would be beneficial. Absolutely.
We also have the ARFRC, and I know Peter Meisenheimer has some thoughts. So maybe I'll call on you, Peter, if you can unmute.
I think I'm unmuted. Am I unmuted?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I want to thank you. Thanks for the invitation to participate in this workshop, first off, and to all the folks who've contributed here. In terms of the projects that are out there, I mean, there's so many things that could be done that I think that the problem we're going to have is which ones do you do first, and which ones get priority. But I do want to expand a little bit on what Aireal was saying earlier, which is that we are keen to build on the experience that we've developed with this technology, and have actually invested in a little bit of surplus equipment in the expectation that there will be a use for it, both in the Great Lakes and in some tributary systems. I hadn't thought of the Ottawa River, but it's really an interesting question. The Ottawa, as recently as the 1960s, had thriving American eel populations, which were sort of a foundational animal in the culture of the Algonquin people. And they migrated right up. You were talking about one of the speakers was, or one of the participants was talking about Lake Temiskaming. I mean, they migrated right up that far, and now, of course, there are none. There was at one point holes in the there were holes in the dams that allowed them to sneak through, but they've plugged them all up now. They're gone. So I mean, there's that kind of work that can be done. But there are also a lot of really interesting things that can be done around places like Lake Nipigon and tributary systems. The work that we've been doing in the Garden River was actually motivated by a question from some folks there about whether there was in fact spawning. There wasn't any. I mean, there were quite a few people who believed that there wasn't a spawning population in the Garden River. They thought it was a matter of fish migrating up the river to feed and not actually reproducing there. And with a combination of knowledge from elders and people on the land in that community, we were able to identify where they had historically been known to spawn, and we were able to go in there and find young fish and find evidence of spawning, and ultimately to take a look at how much of the fish that we're seeing out in the St. Mary's River were actually contributing to the Garden River. And that work goes on, but these sorts of questions all emerged out of those communities in a very straightforward way. You have to ask the question, right? And the same is true of the work we're doing at Giigoonyag right now. So it's all a very rambling, roundabout way of saying we're keen, and we think there are lots of ideas out there based on the conversations we've had with people in the communities where we work. So I think this was really an auspicious event, putting this thing together. I think good things will come from it, and we're keen to be part of it.
Thanks so much, Peter. Are there any other questions or, oh, there's Ken. I'll let Ken say a few words. You just unmute yourself, Ken.
Thanks, Caitlin. Good to hear your voice, Peter. It's been some time. We haven't spoken in a while. Just building on what Peter said and what Janna said around the relationship building, and there's so much. This really seems to be creating its own tsunami in the wave of acoustic telemetry in Lake Huron, and I think we need to ride that tsunami. And perhaps there's an opportunity here. The strength of all of us is in our collaboration and pulling all our resources together to learn more about what's going on in Lake Huron and what the fish are doing, whether it's in the tributaries or whether it's in the lake. And I think, if we see a future where we're all working together, I think that strength and that collaboration will find some of those answers that we've been longing for and looking for, and using both knowledge systems to get us there. I think we're on the brink of something really special here. And if there was a way that we could even advance this even further and having some sort of group discussion about what projects might exist out there in Lake Huron, and then perhaps maybe that bleeds into what other lake systems there might be, like Nipigon or like the Ottawa River, then I think by us all working together, I think there's great strength in that. So I would encourage that, and I know I would support it from my perspective in my position on Lake Huron. So happy to organize something like that to get the ball rolling, because I think, like I said, I'd like to ride this tsunami, and I know I have the support of my colleagues. So thanks for that, and I'll just leave it there.
Go ahead, Chris.
I don't know that I've ever been accused of being someone who's cautious, but the one word of caution I would throw out is that this acoustic telemetry generates a lot of data and a lot of information, and it can be very, very distracting. And so that's why my comments earlier about sharpening the objectives and the questions that are of utmost importance is important. Because I guarantee you, the first time you get your data downloaded and you start looking at what these fish did, your mind is off to the and completely distracted. So, and that's not looking at these fish. Just again, another word of, when you come up with projects, have the questions and the objectives specific, so you're able to answer those, and you're able to do it very well.
Thanks for those words of wisdom. And I don't know if Ry Lauzon wants to speak, but I know we are hoping to have regular updates about projects and to share information when we start to learn more about fish movement in Lake Huron. So I think we do see this as an ongoing conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Caitlin. I wouldn't mind just saying a few words. And I think that I would reference something that Chris provided in the comments, and that's that the project that we're embarking on is really lake wide, and within the Saugeen territory, we're really focusing on the information from community members and our own experts to help us with that. But as far as that knowledge, it basically largely ends at the end of the edge of the territory. So really, if there's other First Nations and tribes that want to participate and to help us to identify other locations that are a priority for lake whitefish and also lake trout as well, certainly please reach out to us, because we would very much welcome your knowledge and expertise in helping us. We don't claim to by any means that, there's so much knowledge out there that we don't have. So the more that we can collaborate as a group throughout the lake, I think the better the project will be, and the more everyone will learn about these fish. So those are, I guess, just a few thoughts on my end. So please reach out to us at the Saugeen Ojibway Nation, or reach out to the Ministry of Natural Resources or Parks. But at the end of the day, we really want to work in collaboration. So very much interested in having those further discussions.
Thanks, Ryan. Well, we're nearing the noon mark here, so I'll just reiterate and say thanks to everyone who presented and attended today. We really appreciate it. I think this is a really cool opportunity to learn more about our lake, Lake Huron and Georgian Bay, and other bodies of water. We'd just like to plug a conference that's coming up in May 17th to 21st, the International Association for Great Lakes Research. Put some info in the chat there, with a generous contribution from the Great Lakes Fishery Commission. Indigenous registrants, the registration fees will be covered as long as you use the code IND21. It's on the website as well. The theme of that conference is bridging knowledges. So, using Indigenous knowledge in Western science, kind of like what we talked about earlier. Myself and Caitlin Almack are helping to chair a session specifically about that sort of stuff. So it'll be a really cool way to, see what's going on in the other Great Lakes as well. And yeah, we'll follow up with the participants with the slides and the recording. And yeah, Chimigwech for everyone coming today. I hope to hear from you, and good luck on all future endeavors, acoustic telemetry and fisheries related.
Thanks, everyone. And thanks, Son, for hosting the Zoom. And thanks for Parks Canada and M&R.